Tonight, we open the file on Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the most misunderstood superstar the game ever produced. A man who won 6 Most Valuable Player awards, a record that still stands as the most ever handed to a single player. A man who in 1984 climbed to the very top of the scoring mountain and stayed there for almost 40 years until LeBron James finally passed him in 2023. A man with 3 college championships, 6 professional titles, and a resume so deep it almost feels invented. And yet, for decades, the people who covered Kareem couldn't seem to find a kind word. They called him cold. They called him distant. They called him difficult to love. One of the deepest thinkers the sport ever produced, and somehow the headlines turned him into a riddle nobody wanted to solve. So here's the question that drives everything you're about to hear. How does a man this successful, this dominant, this decorated, end up this misunderstood? Because this is not a story about failure. There's no collapse here, no fall from grace, no career that crumbled under pressure. This is something stranger. This is the story of a champion who fought harder to be seen as a full human being than he ever fought for a rebound or a ring. A man who changed his name and got punished for it. A man who walked away from Olympic gold to make a point. A man who built a wall around himself so high that the world mistook silence for arrogance. And then, late in life, quietly tried to take that wall down. We're going to follow his whole life, on the court and off it. The records, yes, but also the family, the politics, the loneliness, the misreadings, and the long, slow reckoning that came when the game finally tried to make peace with him. To understand why the world got him so wrong, we have to go back to a Harlem apartment in 1947 and to a boy who was already too tall for the world around him. He was born Ferdinand Lewis Alcindor Jr. in Harlem, New York City in the spring of 1947. The only child of 2 people who carried very different rhythms into that home. His mother, Cora Lillian, worked as a department store price checker. Steady, disciplined, exacting. His father, Ferdinand Sr., wore 2 lives at once. By day, a transit police officer. By night, a jazz musician. Put those together, the order of a working badge and the freedom of a working horn, and you start to understand the man this boy would become. Structured on the outside, improvising underneath. But the lineage ran deeper than that household. His mother had come north as part of the Great Migration, carried up from North Carolina along with millions of other Black Americans, chasing something better than what the South was offering. His father was the child of immigrants from Trinidad, and further back on that branch sat a remarkable figure, his great-uncle, Dr. John Alcindor, a Black activist and medical pioneer whose name still appears in the history books across the Atlantic. Sit with that for a second. Before this child ever bounced a basketball, before anyone projected anything onto him, there was already a bloodline of people who refused to shrink, who organized, who built, who pushed against the limits placed on them. The politics the press would later find so inconvenient weren't an act he picked up. They were in the family blood long before he was born. When he was just 3 years old, in 1950, the family moved into the Dyckman Street projects, up in the Inwood neighborhood at the top of Manhattan. It was a working-class start, a tight world, the kind of place that shapes a kid quietly and permanently. But the thing that would define his childhood wasn't his bloodline, it was his body. Because by the time he was 9 years old, he was already taller than grown men, and the staring had begun. Picture Picture a 9-year-old who already stands 5 feet 8 inches tall, taller than most of the adults in the room, taller than his teachers, taller than anyone in his class. Now imagine being that child and walking into every space already marked, already watched, already whispered about, before you've said a single word. By his own account, the staring took a real toll. As a teenager, he carried a heavy sadness that he later traced directly to those constant stares and the comments people made about his height. This is important because it's the very first crack in the story everybody else would get wrong. The wall this man built, the guardedness the media would one day brand as arrogance, didn't start in a locker room. It started here, in a body that turned him into a spectacle before he ever became a star. And he kept growing. By the 8th grade, he stood 6 feet 8 inches tall, and he could already throw down a dunk. Think about what that means. He hadn't even finished middle school, and he was already a phenomenon. Already a thing people pointed at, measured, and talked about as if he weren't standing right there to hear it. That's the cost nobody put on a stat sheet. Long before the championships, this was a kid learning a hard lesson. Being seen is not the same as being known. When the whole world looks at you, but nobody actually reaches you, you learn to protect what's inside. You go quiet. You watch instead of talk. You build the very thing that strangers will later misread for coldness. When this towering, watchful teenager walked into an all-boys Catholic school as one of its only black students, the isolation he already carried was about to collide with something far uglier. The school was Power Memorial Academy, a private, all-boys Catholic high school in Manhattan. And there, he was one of only a handful of black students walking its halls. He pulled on jersey number 33, a number he chose in tribute to the New York Giants fullback Mel Triplett. It stuck. He would wear that number through college, through the pros, for the rest of his playing life. On the court, what happened next was almost unfair. Under coach Jack Donahue, this teenager turned a high school program into a machine. 3 straight New York City Catholic championships, a 71-game winning streak, an overall record of 79 wins against just 2 losses. They called him the Tower from Power, and the nickname fit. By the time he was done, he had scored 2,067 points, a New York City high school record. He wasn't just good. He was rewriting what was possible for a schoolboy. But the dynasty came with a wound that he carried far longer than any trophy. By his own account, his relationship with Donahue went cold in his final year after the coach used a racial slur against him. He told that story himself years later, and you can hear how deep it cut. Here was a young man giving his school everything: wins, records, glory, and the person meant to guide him crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Think about what that does to a kid who already kept the world at arm's length. The one authority figure who was supposed to have his back instead reminded him exactly how the world saw him. That kind of betrayal hardens something. It teaches you that trust is dangerous, that even your own coach can turn on you with a single word. And that betrayal arrived in the same window as something far larger, because in the summer of 1964, the streets of his own Harlem erupted, and the quiet boy decided exactly who he was going to be. By his teenage years, he wasn't only a basketball prodigy. He is a writer, too. He worked for the Harlem Youth Action Project newspaper, putting words to the world around him. And in the summer of 1964, that world caught fire. It began with tragedy. A New York police officer fatally shot a 15-year-old black teenager named James Powell. The grief and the fury that followed spilled into the streets of Harlem in what became known as the Harlem Riot of 1964. For a young Alcindor, walking those same blocks, it was a turning point. It lit something in him, a real lasting interest in race and politics that would never go out. Years later, he described that moment in words you don't forget.
"Right then and there," he said, "I knew who I was, who I had to be. I was going to be black rage personified, black power in the flesh." Read that again and understand what it meant for the path ahead. The sports world wanted a particular kind of star, a smiling giant, a grateful champion, a man who played the game and kept his opinions to himself. This teenager had already decided to be something else entirely. He had decided to be a conscience, and a conscience makes people uncomfortable, especially when it comes wrapped in a body that big and a talent that loud. So the friction you'll hear about for the rest of this story, the press calling him cold, the public calling him difficult, it doesn't start with a contract dispute or a bad interview. It starts here, on a Harlem street corner in the summer of '64, with a young man making a private vow about who he refused to be. He was already a champion in the making. Now he was becoming something the game had no idea how to handle, and the recruiters lining up at his door had no clue what they were really chasing. By the time he finished high school, the chase for him had become a national obsession. Hundreds of schools came calling. Coaches flooded his mailbox, worked his coaches, courted his family. In the talk of the era, he was described as the most sought-after prospect since Wilt Chamberlain, and that comparison wasn't loose praise. It meant the recruiting world saw this teenager as a once-in-a-generation force, the kind of player a program could build a decade around. But one letter in that pile carried a weight none of the others could match. It came from Jackie Robinson, the man who had already broken baseball's color line, a UCLA alumnus himself, encouraging the young Alcindor to come west to UCLA. Sit with that image for a moment. A teenager from the Dyckman Street projects opening a letter from one of the most important figures in American sports history. When a man like Robinson reaches out, he isn't just selling a school. He's passing something down. He's telling a young black athlete that where he chooses to stand will matter far beyond the court. The push from inside the program came through UCLA assistant coach Jerry Norman, who worked to land him. And the choice the young man finally made was about more than depth charts and championships. UCLA was a basketball decision and a cultural one, a place where a thinking, watchful young black man could build something on his own terms. It was also the start of a relationship that would quietly shape the rest of his public life. The head coach waiting for him in Westwood was John Wooden, a man whose discipline would forge champions and whose approach to the press would help build the very wall the world later mistook for coldness. But none of that came first. What came first was a level of dominance so complete that the people running the sport would reach for their rule book just to slow him down. The legend started in a single night. In his varsity debut for UCLA, he poured in 56 points. Sports Illustrated put a name on it that stuck, the new superstar. And that debut number stood as an NCAA record for a player's first game. Think about that. Most stars need a season to announce themselves. He needed one night. What followed wasn't a hot start. It was a takeover. In his first varsity season, he averaged 29 points and 15.5 rebounds a game.
and he carried UCLA to a perfect 30-0 record and a national championship. Not one loss. Not one team that could solve him. And then came the part that tells you everything about the fear he inspired. After that season, college basketball banned the dunk. Officially, the rule applied to everyone, but nobody pretended it was about everyone. It was widely understood to be aimed at one man, at curtailing the dominance of the towering sophomore who could simply rise up and drop the ball through the rim at will. People didn't even bother with euphemisms. They called it the Alcindor rule, and that ban stayed in place until the 1976 and 77 season, years after he had moved on to the pros. Stop and consider what that says. When a sport changes its own laws to handle a single player, that isn't ordinary greatness. That's a man so far beyond his competition that the institution decides the only fair fight is to take a weapon out of his hands. And there's a deeper echo here, one that runs through his whole story. Throughout his life, the powers around him would keep trying to manage him, contain him, regulate him, on the court with a rule, off the court with a narrative. He responded the way he always would. He adjusted his game, refined his craft, and kept winning anyway. But before the championships piled up, there was one night in front of more than 50,000 people when a single eye injury nearly cracked the myth wide open and handed him the most famous defeat of his life. It happened on the 20th of January, 1968, inside the Houston Astrodome. It was the first nationally televised regular season college basketball game ever played, and the crowd was staggering. 52,693 people packed in to watch. The promoters billed it as the game of the century, UCLA against Houston, Alcindor against the Cougars' star forward Elvin Hayes. But Alcindor walked into that arena hurt. He was playing with an eye injury, and it showed. The most unstoppable player in the country was held to just 15 points. Hayes, meanwhile, lit up the night for 39. When the final buzzer sounded, Houston had won 71-69, ending UCLA's 47-game winning streak. For one televised evening, in front of the largest crowd the sport had ever drawn, the myth looked mortal. He didn't forget it. The two teams met again that season, this time in the semifinals of the NCAA tournament. And this time, Alcindor was healthy. What he did to Houston wasn't a win. It was a message. UCLA crushed the Cougars, 101-69. And the man who had scorched them for 39 in the Astrodome, Elvin Hayes, who was averaging nearly 38 points a game that season, was held to just 10. It remains one of the great acts of revenge basketball has ever seen. Cold, surgical, and complete. There's also a quiet detail buried in that Astrodome story that would follow him for the rest of his career. The eye trouble was no fluke. A scratched cornea would dog him into his professional years, and the answer to it became one of his most recognizable signatures, the protective goggles he wore on the floor. An injury turned into an image. A weakness became part of the look that defined him. Yet even as he was carving out his legend on the court, a private decision in the summer of 1968 was reshaping who he was at the core, a decision the public wouldn't truly understand for years. In the summer of 1968, the young man raised Catholic converted to Sunni Islam. He adopted the name Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. But here's the detail that mattered enormously to how his story would be told. He did not start using that name publicly until 1971. For years, the most important transformation of his inner life stayed largely private, and when it finally surfaced, Parts of the press treated it not as faith, but as provocation, a thing to be questioned rather than respected. That same summer brought a second act of conscience, and this one had a price tag. The 1968 Summer Olympics were coming, and the United States basketball team was bound for gold. He decided not to try out. It was a boycott, a deliberate refusal made in protest of the unequal treatment of African Americans at home. His words cut straight to the bone. He spoke of the futility of winning the gold medal for this country and then coming back to live under oppression. Read that carefully, because it explains the friction that defined his public life. Here was one of the best players alive, walking away from the highest honor amateur basketball could offer to make a point about justice. He wasn't chasing attention. He was refusing to perform patriotism he didn't feel. And he wasn't standing alone. He was among the athletes who publicly aligned themselves with Muhammad Ali during the Vietnam draft resistance era, a moment when the most famous black athletes in America put their careers on the line for principle. That's the company he kept. That's the man he had decided to be back on that Harlem street corner. So by the time he turned professional, he was already more than a basketball player. He was a political figure the sports world had no idea how to control. And the city that drafted him was about to find that out. In the 1969 draft, he went first overall to the Milwaukee Bucks, a franchise that had existed for exactly one season. Think about that gamble from both sides. A brand new team, barely off the ground, suddenly handed the most dominant young big man basketball had seen in years. And a young man from Harlem, shaped by New York and Los Angeles, dropped into the cold and the quiet of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a long way from anything that felt like home. What happened on the floor was almost immediate. He didn't need years to translate his college dominance to the professional game. In 1971, at just 24 years old, he led the Bucks to their first championship in franchise history. The team that had been an expansion afterthought a couple of seasons earlier was suddenly sitting at the top of the basketball world, lifted there by one towering force in the middle. And it was right around that triumph, that same year, that he stepped fully into his name in public. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The private decision of 1968 finally became the public identity. The man the world had drafted as Lou Alcindor now asked to be known by the name his faith had given him. For some, it was a moment of respect. For others, especially in parts of the press, it was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, even threatening. And that discomfort would shadow how he was covered for years. So here's the strange shape of his early career. He had everything the game claimed to value. A championship at 24, a ring in a city that worshipped what he did on the court, even as it never quite became his city. Production that made the rest of the league look ordinary. And yet the gap between what he achieved and how he was understood was already growing wider. He had conquered Milwaukee, but the stage he truly belonged on, the lights big enough to match his game and his mind, were waiting 2,000 miles west, and getting there would mean an old wall meeting a brand new spotlight. In 1975, the move finally came. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was traded from Milwaukee to the Los Angeles Lakers, and with that deal, the second great act of his career began. The final 14 seasons he would spend in a Lakers uniform. He was going home, in a way, back to the city where he'd built his college legend, back to the lights, back to the coast that fit him better than the cold middle of the country ever had. On paper, it looked like a perfect marriage. Here was the most cerebral, most dominant big man in the sport, landing in the entertainment capital of the world. A franchise that had drifted was about to be reinvented around him. In time, his contributions would be described as a key component of what the league came to call the Showtime era, that fast, dazzling championship brand of Lakers basketball that lit up arenas across the country. 5 more titles were waiting for him in Los Angeles, though the era's defining co-star hadn't arrived yet. But here's the irony the whole investigation keeps circling back to. You would think a move to Hollywood, to the brightest stage in American sports, would have softened the man, loosened him up, pulled him out of his shell. It did the opposite, at least in the eyes of the people covering him. The bigger the spotlight got, the more guarded he seemed. The more cameras pointed his way, the more remote he came across. He was surrounded by glamour and still read as cold, surrounded by celebrity and still misunderstood. So how does a man standing in the warmest spotlight in the game keep coming off as distant? To answer that, we have to go back further than any trade, further than any contract, back to the one teacher who shaped how he handled the press before he ever played a single professional minute. The man waiting for him at UCLA all those years earlier was John Wooden, one of the most revered coaches the sport has ever produced. Wooden built champions on discipline, on structure, on humility, and, by Kareem's own account, on a deep distrust of the press. In Wooden's program, the media was treated as a distraction, a nuisance, something not to be trusted. He discouraged his players from seeking attention and actively coached them away from it. For a young man already inclined to keep the world at arm's length, that lesson didn't just stick, it fused to his bones. By his own recollection, the demand from reporters during his college years was so intense that Wooden simply shut it down, telling the press they couldn't talk to him at all. Think about what that does. At the exact age when most stars learn to handle a microphone, he was being taught to avoid one. He said it plainly himself, looking back years later. It had a negative effect on how I was portrayed, he admitted. But I had no one to explain the value of public relations to me. When I was in college, there was such an intense demand from the press that John Wooden said they couldn't talk to me at all. And then the line that says everything. It made me suspicious and cautious with the media, and I maintained that attitude for way too long. For way too long. That's the confession at the heart of this whole story. The arrogance the public thought it was watching was in large part a discipline drilled into a teenager, a survival code handed down by a coach he respected, a code that protected him in college and then quietly poisoned how he was seen for the next 2 decades. It outlived its usefulness by years and kept charging him interest the entire time. But silence wasn't the only reason they pinned the word difficult on him, because the real trouble started on the days he did speak, when the press heard exactly what was on his mind and decided they didn't like it. Here's the part that almost nobody got right while it was happening. The man behind the wall wasn't cold. He was shy. By his own admission, deeply reserved. An introvert dropped into a profession that demands constant performance, off the court as well as on it. He said as much himself, with a kind of quiet honesty that's hard to argue with. When it came to talking to people, I was kind of reserved, he reflected. But shyness is something you have to overcome. Later in my career, I started doing a lot better relating to fans and talking to the media. That's not a villain talking. That's a man describing a lifelong battle with his own nature and admitting he didn't win it overnight. But shyness, mislabeled, becomes arrogance in a headline. And the contradiction only got sharper when you actually read what he wrote. His writing for Time magazine, his many opinion pieces over the years, they showed a depth and a range that few athletes in any era ever reached. The man could think, and he could put those thoughts on a page. Yet the branding of his demeanor as cold or arrogant clung to him anyway, despite decades of thoughtful, substantive engagement with the world. Years later, Isaiah Thomas put his finger on the real wound. Thomas pointed out that here was a man who had authored multiple books and been the subject of more than one documentary. And still, the media insisted Kareem Abdul-Jabbar couldn't communicate. Thomas's framing was blunt and unforgettable. The press said he couldn't communicate, Thomas argued, because they didn't like what he was saying. That's the dimension the box scores never captured. A thinking black athlete, willing to talk about race and politics and faith, got recast as difficult, not because the words were unclear, but because they made people uncomfortable. Even some of his fellow stars came to feel that this distorted portrayal cost him in the all-time great conversations he should have dominated. While the press kept arguing about his personality, though, the man himself was busy doing something undeniable. He was rewriting the record books, one skyhook at a time, and in 1984, he reached a number no human being in the history of the league had ever touched. The weapon that carried him there was the most beautiful and the most unfair shot the game has ever seen, the skyhook. A high, arcing release fired off one leg, the ball leaving his fingertips somewhere up near the rafters. Impossible to block, impossible to rush, impossible to copy. Other players had signature moves. He had a signature that defined an entire career. A shot so reliable, it functioned less like a move and more like a law of physics. Defenders knew it was coming. It didn't matter. It went in anyway. And in 1984, that shot carried him to the top of the mountain. He broke the National Basketball Association's all-time career scoring record, a number that came to define the era and stood as one of the most untouchable marks in all of sports. For decades after, when people talked about the greatest scorers who ever lived, his name sat at the very summit. But the record didn't stand forever, and honesty demands we say so plainly. He held that scoring crown from 1984 all the way until 2023, when LeBron James finally passed him. Nearly 4 decades on top. That's not a footnote. That's a reign longer than most players' entire lives in the league. When he finally walked away at the age of 42 in 1989, the numbers he left behind read like a fantasy. The career leader in points with 38,387. The leader in games played with 1,560. The leader in minutes with 57,446. He sat atop the lists in field goals made and in blocked shots, and in category after category beyond that. And through it all, those protective goggles he'd first reached for after the cornea trouble of his college days remained. The visual signature of 20 years of quiet, relentless dominance. Yet even as he sat alone at the top of basketball's most important list, the championships in Los Angeles weren't a solo act. They came with a partner, a fast break, and a brand of basketball that turned a whole city into a Friday night party. By the time it was all over, the trophy case was almost absurd. 6 championships as a player, 1 in Milwaukee and 5 more out west in Los Angeles. 2 Finals Most Valuable Player awards, the first back in 1971 and the second in 1985, 14 years apart, which tells you something about how long he stayed great. And 19 All-Star selections, an honor handed out once a year, which means for 19 different seasons, the league looked at its very best and put his name on the list. The Los Angeles titles came inside that dazzling Showtime machine, and this is where the story turns generous. Across 20 professional seasons, his teams reached the playoffs 18 times, advanced past the first round 14 times, and made it all the way to the finals on 10 separate occasions. That's not the arc of a man who came up short. That's the arc of a man who was almost always still playing when the lights were brightest. But Showtime, by its very design, was a shared spotlight. The fast breaks, the no-look passes, the run-and-gun spectacle. That style demanded a co-star, and one arrived to share the marquee. And here's where the misreading of Abdul-Jabbar took on one more strange layer. The older statesman in the middle, the disciplined giant with the skyhook, was the steady spine of that team, the constant who'd been winning titles since some of his teammates were children. Yet the easy charm, the megawatt smile, the camera-ready joy of the era often got attached to others. He did the foundational work. He just rarely got to be the face of the fun. It's a fitting summary of the whole tension. He had the rings, the records, the longevity, and the respect of everyone who actually played against him. What he didn't have was the warm public embrace that should have come with it. And as the cheering finally faded, and the goggles came off for the last time, a second life was waiting. One in which the most misunderstood man in the game would slowly, and on his own terms, start letting the world see who he'd been all along. When the game finally let him go, something unexpected happened. The man the press had spent 20 years calling cold started to thaw. Not because he changed, but because the world finally slowed down enough to hear him. The pace of retirement gave him room. And in that room, he began to reveal the person who had always been there, behind the guarded eyes. It came out in his writing first. Essays, books, sharp, careful commentary on history and race and culture. He'd been thinking these thoughts the whole time. Now he had the space to put them down without a microphone shoved in his face after a back-to-back. He became a best-selling author, the kind of writer whose name on a cover actually moved copies. The intelligence and compassion that caution had hidden for so long were suddenly out in the open, page after page, for anyone willing to read. And the establishment that once shrugged at him began, slowly, to bow. In 2012, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton selected him as a United States Global Cultural Ambassador, sending the once difficult athlete out into the world as a representative of the country he had spent his youth challenging. 4 years later, in 2016, President Barack Obama placed the Presidential Medal of Freedom around his neck, the highest civilian honor the nation can give. Read those two moments together, and you start to feel the irony. The substance the sports writers had ignored for decades was now being recognized at the very top of American public life. There was a lighter side to this second act, too, one that proved he'd been in on the joke all along. Long before any of it, he had trained in the martial art of Jeet Kune Do under none other than Bruce Lee, and he appeared alongside Lee in the film Game of Death, released in 1972. Then, in 1980, he turned up in the comedy Airplane, playing a pilot named Roger Murdoch, a character who keeps getting recognized as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and keeps insisting he's somebody else. A man standing inside his own legend, gently mocking it. That's not the move of someone with no sense of humor. That's a man who understood his myth better than the people writing about it ever did. And yet, even as the White House honored him and Hollywood let him laugh at himself, the cameras that had built the legend still left an empty chair where his voice should have been. Here is one of the strangest gaps in his whole story. For much of his post-playing life, the man with 6 Most Valuable Player awards and the longest scoring reign in league history was almost nowhere to be found on the major sports television platforms. The studios that shape how fans remember the game ran on without him. Meanwhile, contemporaries he'd shared the floor with, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, moved comfortably into studio chairs and executive offices, becoming familiar faces all over again to a new generation. Think about how odd that is. When the networks needed a voice to explain greatness, to break down the modern game, to carry the history forward, the most decorated big man of his era was rarely the one they called. The chair sat empty. And the recognition that did eventually come arrived late and a little awkwardly. The league began folding him into more ceremonial roles. His commentary and his writing finally started drawing the overdue acclaim they deserved. But as plenty of observers noted, the correction came years after it should have. For a long stretch, the basketball world honored his numbers while quietly ghosting the man behind them. And the numbers kept getting honored, even as the man stayed off stage. In 2007, ESPN named him the greatest center of all time. In 2008, the greatest player in college basketball history. In 2016, the second best player in the entire history of the professional game, behind only Michael Jordan. That's about as high as the praise gets. Yet the praise was for the resume, the skyhook, the records, not for the living, thinking, present-day man who could have been telling those stories himself. So what was the empty chair really about? There are different versions, and honesty means holding all of them. One version says it was a snub, the old grudge from the press carried forward, a quiet refusal to embrace a man they'd never warmed to. Another says it was his own choice, the guardedness drilled into him at UCLA, the lifelong instinct to keep the cameras at arm's length, simply playing out one more time. The likeliest truth is that it was both at once. A man who built a wall, and an industry that was happy to leave it standing. But late in life, the man the press once called impossible finally offered an answer about all of it, and it was far gentler than anything they ever said about him. After everything, the misreadings, the cold labels, the empty chair, you might expect bitterness. You might expect a man with every right to settle scores. Instead, what he offered late in life was something quieter and far more generous. Speaking about the very people who had spent decades getting him wrong, he said simply, "A lot of the people in the media are good people, and by being more accessible, you get to find that out." Sit with how disarming that is. No score settling, no grievance, just a man conceding in his measured way that part of the distance had been his own doing, and that the cure had been within reach the whole time, by being more accessible. He told us before that he kept the wall up way too long, that the suspicion drilled into him as a teenager outlived its usefulness by years. Here, near the end, he closed the loop. He owned his half of it. But this story has never asked you to flatten the truth into one tidy lesson, and it won't now. Because the record holds two things at once, and both are real. Yes, he stayed guarded too long. And yes, the press took a thinker, a man who wrote for major magazines, who spoke openly about faith and justice, and recast him as a villain because they didn't like what he had to say. Public accounts differ on how much blame falls where. The honest answer is that it falls on both sides, and pretending otherwise would betray everything we've learned about him. What doesn't differ? It's the body of work. 6 Most Valuable Player awards, still the most any single player has ever been given. The longest scoring reign the league has ever seen, held from 1984 until LeBron James finally passed him decades later. A member of 6 championship teams as a player, and 2 more as an assistant coach. A man who kept winning even after the cheering for him personally had quieted. And, hardest one of all, the late and unlikely title of a man who finally let himself be seen. Which leaves us with the one question this entire investigation has been building toward. The question of what it really cost to be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So let's answer it plainly. He didn't fail at being understood. He was misjudged by a sports machine that wanted a simpler man than he was ever willing to be. That's the whole riddle, finally cracked open. The world labeled him difficult, but difficult was never the truth. The truth was that he was complicated and private and serious and black and proud in an era and an industry that preferred its giants smiling and silent. Everything we followed leads back to that single misreading. The towering boy who learned that being seen was not the same as being known. The high schooler wounded by a coach who was supposed to protect him. The young man who took a new name and a new faith and got treated like a provocation for it. The champion who walked away from Olympic gold rather than perform a patriotism he didn't feel. The teenager taught to distrust the press, who carried that lesson 2 decades too far. Each piece looks like coldness from the outside. Each piece up close is something far more human. And here's the part that should sit with you. Even with all of it working against him, the labels, the empty chair, the warmth that never quite came, he still built one of the most complete lives any athlete has ever assembled. 3 college championships, 6 professional titles, the record for most valuable player awards, the longest scoring reign in the history of the game. Then best-selling books, a Presidential Medal of Freedom, a turn as a cultural ambassador, a martial arts apprenticeship under Bruce Lee, and the self-awareness to stand in a movie and laugh at his own legend. He won on the court, he won on the page, he won eventually the long fight to be seen whole. That's the file we close tonight. Not the story of a man who came up short, but the story of a man the world kept trying to shrink, with a rule, with a label, with a narrative, and who refused every single time to be smaller than he was. They called him difficult. History is calling him something else now. A champion, a thinker, a conscience. The genius the world called difficult, who outlasted every easy word they ever used against him and made them learn his real name.